Starting first with, how bad is it? Okay, here's what happens to us over the next few years. So you could see that through 2000 till the recession hit, things were actually meandering along okay. The problem is the seeds of the problem that we have today had already been planted. And they were planted long ago when Medicare and Medicaid in particular programs were set up. And everybody knew the baby boomer generation was going to retire at some time, but nobody wanted to talk about it. A little known fact, Alan Greenspan told me this, that when his commission, the Social Security Commission, was set up, they had two charges. One was Social Security, the other was Medicare, Medicaid, which they knew was going to be a problem. And at the time, they said, Social Security is a problem now, Medicare, Medicaid is a problem in 25 years, we'll let them worry about it then, because it'll be tough enough just getting Social Security done. Well, guess what? It's 25 years later, baby boomer generation, my generation, is retiring, so we're going to run into this problem. It was exacerbated by the recession. And in the recession, I mean, I fully supported the spending and thought the stimulus, all that stuff made sense, was good to do. But at the end of the day, it's put us into a position where we have 73% debt to GDP today. And when you look at where this thing is going, this is where we say it'll go through 2022, making reasonable assumptions about what the government's likely to do. And this will all get updated probably today. The CBO is going to issue new numbers. But it's tough to look at this and say there's not a problem ahead. Next chart. And just to kind of put it into perspective, as much as people have complained about like the Reagan budgets and how bad that deficit spending was, or the Civil War and what had to happen, you take a look at where our debt to GDP is. It's the worst it's been in 230 years, except for the end of World War II, when we had a very good reason to be spending the way we are. Next one. So let's take a look at some of the assumptions in that first page. If you take a look at the economic assumptions, it looks kind of reasonable, unless you say the last decade is a prelude to, or a prologue to what we're going to be seeing. And if you said, well, gee, you know, what if it grew like it did in this last decade? What would be the impact of that? Next slide. Now, if you take a look at some of the, what's going to be the biggest driver, Medicare, Medicaid. If you take a look at Medicare and Medicaid, those are both done on a per capita basis. And what it says is in Medicare, despite how it's grown in the past, in an 11 and 22, in this coming decade, we're saying it'll only grow at about 2.9% a year. If you take a look at Medicaid, it says it'll grow at 4.2% a year versus what's occurred in the past. And if you say, I want to do this on a total dollar basis with both of these, it says it'll only grow about 6% in this coming decade. Now, the thing to remember is that includes the baby boomer generation retiring, and it includes the impact of the Affordable Care Act. So it says, okay, it's only going to grow 6% even though we have those two phenomena. Okay, next chart. So if you say, well, okay, here's the current law projections. If you assume the sequester doesn't happen, that the doc fix, as they refer to it, where it's set up in law that provider payments go down, but for something like 12 or 13 times in a row, the Congress has voted to not allow that to happen. So it's reasonable to assume it happens a 13th time or a 14th time. And that the tax extenders, things like the depreciation bonus, R&D tax credit, stuff that people like, continues. Now you say, okay, I've actually got a $21 trillion problem. Now if I said, okay, what if GDP just grew at the same rate it did in the last decade? That adds another $2 trillion. And if you said, what if I just assumed that Medicare, Medicaid spending grew the same rate as it did in this last decade? Now you have a $25 trillion problem and 109%. And for any of you who do any kind of business planning, you never plan your business for the best possible outcome, right? Because use your own word, but things happen, right? They just do. And to not plan for it, not assume it's going to come, is a mistake. So this leaves us almost no room for any problems, and we end up with over 100% of GDP as debt. Next page. So if we end up with that, and with that kind of debt, that also says our annual interest bill is about $1 trillion a year. So, you're all smart kids. You deal with millions in some of your data. You deal with billions when you look at big companies. Trillion just seems like another number, right? The next one up the scale. So what I've done is I've tried to come up with a way that said, and I wish I'd come up with this, but I didn't. I had my assistant Google a bunch of ideas and said, okay, I'm going to grab this one. If you try to say, okay, so what is $1 trillion? How do you describe it in a way people can relate? So that's what we got to this one. Next slide. You think about that. If you had, to most of us, $1 million is a lot of money. And if you had spent $1 million a day for over 2,012 years, you still would not have spent $1 trillion. And that'll just be our interest bill. Right? So that's what we're facing. Okay, next. And if you say, okay, well, I mean, we all complain about Europe and how stultifying the economy is and how nobody moves. Now say, okay, so how does our budget deficit, annual deficit, compare on a percent of GDP with all these other countries? God, we're up there with Spain and Greece. And you look at how much stuff you read about those countries. Now you say, okay, how about debt as a percent of GDP? Okay, we don't look too bad today, the 2011 actual, even though we're at Spain's level and we know what's happening to Spain. Now if you say, well, gee, if I take that up a notch because of the CBO alternative that I showed you, and then let's assume that things aren't as good as we hope, look at where we end up versus all these countries in Europe that we point to in our newspapers and media and say, God, thank God we're not them. Well, we kind of are. It's just that we're big enough and we're a reserve currency and the world is flocking to us, assuming that we'll do the right things. But this would say, when you look at how we're doing versus Europe, it's not that great a story. Okay, next chart. So here's the nut of the question, is so where's all this money going? And everybody loves to point to, geez, we got to stop foreign aid, or that $60,000 beekeeper study, why do we do stupid stuff like that? But if you take a look at it and say, so where is the money really going? There's almost 2/3 of the budget that goes to what we call mandatory spending. So you know how the Congress is supposed to appropriate money for programs? For about 2/3 of all the spending, they don't do any appropriation. The program is the program. The government spends whatever the government spends. There's no appropriation connected with it. So you put all that together, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other mandatory type stuff, so some of the veterans benefits and Medicare, medical programs that they have, pension programs, all that stuff. You put that with interest that you have to pay, and you take it down to 2012, you say, okay, it's still about 2/3, but look at what happens over the next 10 years. It becomes 3/4 of all our spending is driven by these programs where there's no appropriation of any kind. The spending is just the spending. And that discretionary, by the way, that's where the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Interior, Education, all those other programs and departments are. They really are a small, and about on that discretionary spend, about half of that is defense. So you can end up seeing that there's no way to avoid it. There's a mandatory spend problem. Next chart. And when you take a look at these assumptions, today we're collecting about $2.6 trillion in taxes. With the tax increases now reflected, that'll be about $4.7 trillion a year as we get 10 years out. So you'd say, okay, there's a fair amount of money coming in at the same time, and we still end up in that problem. Next chart. And if you take a look at historically, I found this chart really interesting. The blue line is tax revenue as a percent of GDP. The red line is spending as a percent of revenue. And you can see those lines seldom meet, meaning that we continue to acquire debt. But interestingly, if you take a look at that blue line, it kind of hovers around 18%. 18% of GDP gets taken as tax revenue. Now, the part that's interesting, some of this is before you were born, but believe it or not, back in these days, pre-Reagan, the top tax rate was about 70 or 80%. So when you take a look at the high earners, the over 250,000 crowd that everybody likes to point to, they were taking 70% of their income. So what would happen, and this was one of Ronald Reagan's big points, is, well, if you're going to make more than 250,000, you stop working, or you just stop. So you get all these behaviors that people just don't count on, and it says that almost no matter what the rate is, you tend to get about 18% of tax revenue because people adjust. They figure out a different way to work or a different way to do things. That gap has gotten significantly bigger than it was before. And the problem we're running into is now we're getting such a debt burden that if anything bad ever does happen, it's like you run out of a certain amount of Keynesianism that you can do to revive something. Next page. So what do we need to do? We actually need to come up with about a $4 trillion debt reduction plan. And the point that we keep trying to make down there is something will happen here. And it can happen in one of two ways. One is the bond market forces you to do it. And that's what you saw in Greece and you're starting to see in Europe. The second one is you can do it thoughtfully and proactively the way a great country does. And so far, we're leaning towards the bond market approach and not really addressing the other piece. There's two big things that need to happen. The first one is entitlement reform. So whether you go to change CPI, you adjust eligibility ages to recognize that people are living longer. Means testing, everybody wants to think that that's a big money item. It's not. It's more of a psychology item. If you took it down and said, okay, anybody over $250,000, you're not going to get Medicare, you're not going to get Social Security, saves you about $30 billion a year. So, okay, you need to do it. The psychology is important, but you shouldn't confuse that with a solution. And in fact, if you try to solve it through means testing, you have to go down to something like $30,000 or $40,000 in income that you say anybody above that doesn't get it. So it's one of those, yeah, you got to do it, but don't confuse that with a solution. The CPI, this is just an idea that says, how do you start to turn this around? Instead of saying the program is the program, instead you say something like, this is how much money we're going to allocate for this, and it'll get apportioned in some way. Tax reform, I'm sure a bunch of you are familiar with the principle of entropy, where all organized systems evolve to chaos. That's our tax system. Right? The last time we redid this was like 25 years ago. It needs to be done again. The thing's a mess. And when you compare where we are versus the countries that we compete with in the world, we're not incentivizing any of the right stuff. And everybody loves to, one of my favorite ones, companies' access to overseas cash. When you take a look at how much money is held outside the US, just because the repatriation tax is so onerous that nobody does it, and all the nefarious motives that are ascribed to companies in terms of why they're doing this. I mean, we're having a ridiculous economic argument today, and it's another thing that needs to be addressed. Companies, individuals, capital gains, I think should be all about the same top rate so that people don't spend their time trying to figure out, gee, do I organize as a company or an individual? Do I want to try to get my money as capital gains or dividends instead of ordinary income? I mean, it's a silly argument. It should be income's income. Top rate's the same for everybody. Next. Okay, so if you said, what's a potential $4 trillion plan? The first one, overseas contingent operations, that's kind of government code for Afghanistan and Iraq. So this is the way they do stuff so that you can't recognize it. But it says this saving will happen with everybody coming back, but only if the government doesn't spend it again in some other way. So I've always felt it's important to show it just to make sure that everybody realizes you have to make it happen. Taxes, this adds to about $1.3 trillion in new taxes beyond what we already have. And then addresses entitlement reform and some additional discretionary spending. Now the problem, of course, is none of this is easy. Nobody likes this, right? No congressman wants to say, I'm going to raise your taxes and I'm going to decrease spending. They all want to say, I'm going to lower your taxes and I'll increase spending on this, which is how you end up in this kind of a problem. But this is a potential possibility. And there's plenty of other plans out there. This is just a point that it is doable. Next one. And if we do that, instead of that chart that I showed you before that went from 73 to 86, which by the way gets a lot worse in the second decade because as Again, the baby boomer generation retires. The first decade is not the big spend. The second decade is the big spend. So this gets significantly worse in that second decade. You can have a curve that looks a lot more like this. Still not good. Now, this is not a good phenomenon, but it's a hell of a lot better than the red line. Next chart. So why isn't it happening? And I really got a insight into this. Ted mentioned that I was on the SimpsonBowles Commission, so I got a chance to see some of this stuff up close, which was just fascinating. First one was just the lack of trust and relationships. You know, you read about it, until you actually see it, it's really kind of surprising. And how often people just kind of walk into their neutral corner and spew whatever their saying is when they're talking to their constituents, as opposed to really thinking about something, because then it requires engagement. The relationships surprised me, that when key Senate people were meeting key House people for the first time. So there shouldn't be like that. There should be more of a connection so that people can relate on more of a personal basis and be able to establish some kind of trust. Public versus private conversations, this is astounding. You have two different people, the one that you deal with when it's just you and three other people, and the one that's there when the camera turns on. Because when the camera, so anytime you see anything where it says, we need this negotiation in public, the camera's got to watch it, you should say, there is nothing that's going to come out of this. Nothing. Because they've got to work to their constituents, and nobody wants to be on camera saying something that's going to cause them a problem later on. Speed and sense of urgency, it seems like there's always more time. And as one guy, a military guy, actually observed to me about another department, he said, a successful meeting here is an agreement to have another meeting. And I always thought that was more insightful than maybe he realized. But it did seem to be like that, this whole sense of urgency. I can remember getting a call to be on the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and I said, okay, yeah, I'll do it. I've been complaining about this thing for years, so I am a good New Hampshire Republican. I got to do what I think is right here. I said, all right, how quickly do I need to adjust? He said, oh, it's going to happen fast. I said, okay, well, I mean, fast to me is tomorrow, so if I need to be there. I said, I have to go to Africa the week after next for a business trip. Am I okay doing that? Yeah, you should be able to do that. I said, okay. I went to Africa, came back for 3 weeks, went to Asia for 3 weeks, came back, and we had our first meeting. Same thing on the this kind of who, what, when. I remember going to my first committee meeting, and we get to the end. We've been having this great discussion for an hour and a half, and they get ready to conclude the meeting. And I raised my hand and said, well, what do we do next? Who's doing what? They said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, I finish every meeting with who, what, and when. So what do you want us to do? And it was the chairman of the meeting who looked at me and said, well, feel free to send in your suggestions. Boom, meeting adjourned. That was it. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way to run the place. It's like, the other thing is I ended up learning it's important to be fashionably late in the Congress. So meetings used to be like 9:30. I would show up at 9:30, and I was not just the first principal there, I beat all the staffers. There were no staffers there yet. So over time, I said, okay, I got to learn to be a little later here. So I would make a point of always being 15 to 20 minutes late, and I was still the first guy in the meeting. So how does the place run? One of my other observations, which was kind of interesting, was after several months, I said, all conversation down here is ruled by the 3 H's: hysteria, histrionics, and hyperbole. Everything, every conversation. And the inane conversations that you run into, where I can remember watching a Republican and a Democrat go at it, and the Republican was saying, these are just government IOUs in the Social Security Trust Fund. There's nothing there, and these are just IOUs, and we need to recognize that. And then the Democrat is saying, no, those are investments in AAA gilt-edged government bonds. This is the most secure investment you can have for that money. And I remember sitting, I looked at both of them and said, what are you arguing about? There's no money there. You know, it doesn't matter what you call it. There is no money in the trust fund. It's a piece of paper. There's no money there. And I also told them if I did this in Honeywell and said, you know, the best investment for my Honeywell pension fund is Honeywell bonds and Honeywell stock. So you would put me in jail. You'd call me in front of Congress and I'd be in jail. But it's just the way the place works, but it's amazing how much time they'll spend doing that. My second observation, you've probably maybe seen me say this publicly, is growing up in New Hampshire and running companies for a living, what I thought, what I said, what I did, all had to be the same thing. For these guys, it's 3 separate decisions. It really is. Because what they're thinking isn't necessarily what they'll say. What they say isn't necessarily what they'll do. And what they do isn't necessarily what they think. It's remarkable. So you end up having to deal with this. It's very easy to get played as a businessman being down there because Ted mentioned I was working on some of this debt stuff. And one of the things I know is both sides think you're being used by the other and you're just too naive to realize that. The other thing is they're always telling you, you go back and tell those guys this. And I always say, look, I'm happy to, but you know, at the end of the day, I'm going to stick with what do I think is economically responsible here, and that's going to continue to be our message. Ideology really does drive some of the folks down there. I mean, they really just get hung up on the ideology and kind of forget this point that I try to have at the bottom, is there's a greater tendency now to look at compromise as being a synonym for giving in, as opposed to recognizing that compromise is a synonym for governing. Right? You need to recognize the other guy has a point of view too, and he has a vote. So you need to be able to accommodate all that. The last one is really real, and that's fear of the voters. They are scared to death of the voters, and they are scared to death of being kicked out of office at some point. And interestingly, the one they worry about the most is their primary on both sides. If you're on the left, you worry, a Democrat, you worry about an attack from the left. If you're a Republican, you worry about an attack from the right. So it really causes everybody to not just be looking at, so what do I believe, but they're thinking about, when I go to my primary, where do I need to be positioned with anything I've said or any action that I've taken so that I don't damage myself with the far left or the far right. But as a result of that, it kind of pushes people to the extremes instead of putting them with what I call the radical middle. You know, that 70% of us who are kind of in the middle on everything and say, you know, just get along, do the right thing, and kind of move along here. Next chart. So what can you do? How can you help? We have this petition to fix the debt. You could find it at fixthedebt.org, I believe. To the extent you can sign up and sign your friends up, terrific. You have to let your political leaders know. And right now, for them, it's still a case of the risk of doing nothing is still safer than the risk of doing something. And you have to turn that around. And the only way that gets turned around is if they start to hear from you and say, compromise, get something done. And the context that I try to pull this into for all of them is that 20 years ago, there were only 1 billion people participating in the global economy. Right? There was the US, Western Europe, and Japan, basically. Today, 20 years later, there's about 4 billion people actively participating in the global economy because we've added China, India, Russia and the CIS states, other countries that recognize a private sector as the key to prosperity. Yet we still act like we did 20 years ago. You know, we haven't really changed how we think about things, whether it's debt, energy policy, infrastructure, math and science education, tort reform, free trade. We still act like we did 20 years ago. So there's a bunch of stuff we need to get done, yet we're still arguing about this one item that we should be able to fix. And the rest of the world looks at us and they look to the US for leadership. Because if you look at the world's big democracies right now, they're in gridlock over debt. Japan, India, EU, US, all the developed economies, the democracies are in gridlock over debt. Somebody needs to exercise some leadership here in order to get the global economy moving again. And I keep arguing that it should be us. We're the world's biggest economy by far, If we can start to demonstrate some leadership, not only does it help to pull the rest of the world, but it gives them an example to follow. And that was really reinforced for me with the discussion I was having with the Romanian ambassador to the US. This was back when I was on SimpsonBowles. And he came to visit me and said, you know, US, you guys really need to do something about your debt. And I said, yeah, I know, we're working on it. We need to get our economy. And he said, no, don't misunderstand me. We need you as a model. Because in Romania, we have the same problem. And as we look at this, one of our arguments is, look, if the US can't even figure this out, what hope do we have? So we are waiting to see what the US does. To the extent you do something, it makes it easier for us. So even though other countries may complain about us from time to time, we're still a model when it comes to how do we run our economy. And for me, this is the question, is, you know, do we still have that political will to be a great country, to make the tough decisions when you need to? And these are some tough decisions, but we need to make them. And we're just not doing it today. And you can help. To the extent that you let your elected leaders know, you can make a difference here. And I think that's it. That concludes the debt.